right, you're listening to Another Year by Purely Gray. This is Smug and Play, the internet's premier source of information on Windows 9X games, cultures, and technology. And this year, we finally arrived in the holiday season. It's been a rough year. We're all looking for warmth and comfort. And of course, we're not going to get the warmth and comfort of our families because coronavirus is raging. But that's not typically the sort of warmth and comfort that we sort of retro PC enthusiasts are usually after anyway. What we're really looking for is the warmth and comfort of a good CPU-GPU pairing. And so we've brought to you in this episode our last build video for 2020, a winter build. And this year was interesting in that AMD retook the x86 performance crown. And so we want to talk a little bit about a build from an era when AMD previously held the performance crown, and that was when, Alan?
04 to 06 mainly. Back then, Intel was experimenting with very extreme architectures for CPUs. And they, put it. Long story short, it produced a lot of heat, and they had difficulty getting performance up, especially because those processors weren't really doing much per clock tick.
Yeah, so that time, you know, Intel was using their NetBurst architecture from the Pentium 4, which had these extremely long pipelines, each pipeline stage being very short and ineffectual in order to support, ultimately, they hoped, super fast clock speeds, but unfortunately physics, material science got in the way of ever hitting the sort of like 7 or 8 gigahertz targets that they had.
And AMD had paired sort of a more normal processor design with an integrated memory controller, which Intel didn't have at the time. And that meant that it could access memory a lot faster than the Intel systems. And this is when games and computer programs were getting very complicated, needing a lot of bandwidth, for all those bits. So AMD was just really chugging along. And Intel didn't really have anything to show for it until later in the year when they released the Core 2 Duos.
So they had something of 2006, right? AMD has released the Swan Song for their Socket 939 platform. They're going to move on to Socket AM2, but they released one more processor for their successful, with gamers, with enthusiasts, Socket 939 platform, and that is a special version of the Athlon 64X2 called the Athlon 64 FX-60. Tell us about this beast from AMD in 2006.
So FX was AMD's sort of, extreme edition line. Intel had released, because of their issues with processors, they had to release these very expensive processors to compete. And AMD figured, well, if they're selling a processor for $1,000, why shouldn't we? Yeah. So this was their top of the line flagship processor with 2 cores, clocked at 2.6 gigahertz. This is before we had turbo boosts and stuff. It is what it is, man.
That's right. There's no turbo frequency. It's 2.6. But because it's their FX chip, their premium line, it's unlocked. It's multiplier unlocked. And so you can set this thing for whatever you think you can get away with. And so some people at the time of release were sort of upset because the outgoing FX-57 processor, which was their last unlocked Socket 939 chip, their single core one, had a clock speed of 2.8 gigahertz, but the stock clock on the FX-60 was cut down to 2.6. But as I learned through experimentation, getting an FX-60 to 2.8 is no problem at all. You just select the higher multiplier and it works. There really weren't too many issues with individual samples not being able to hit 2.8. Most people were able to get it to around 2.9, sometimes 3. And typically adding additional voltage didn't help, or at least that's what people in the time said. I decided I didn't want to try pushing mine too far because I don't have a water cooling solution or something like that. But yeah, the FX-60, a pretty impressive chip for January of 2006. We've got a megabyte of L2 cache per core. We've got 1,000 megahertz hypertransport bus at 2,000 megatransfers a second, and 110 watt reported TDP.
Well, we needed to make this build, something that Austin could cuddle up with in winter.
That's right. The point of this is
in
to keep
his
your
lonely
feet warm.
times.
That's right. Underneath the desk, this thing's got to keep your feet warm. So 110 watt TDP, not a lot necessarily by modern standards, but for retro computing standards, in 2006, this was a pretty hot processor and required some pretty serious cooling. And as Alan said, this is a premium product. The initial list price for this was $1,031 in 2006 money. That's in 1,000 quantities to resellers. So that's big money. And these things are hard to find even today. I was very fortunate to come across one because we don't do a whole lot of ultimate builds like other YouTube channels do. I think we're more interested in ridiculous OEM budget builds where we kind of cobble together. It's basically junkyard wars is more our sort of modus operandi. But for the sake of keeping ourselves warm this winter, I decided we would go FX-60. You want to say anything more about the processor before we talk about the Mobo?
Mostly that it's not as hot as today, but people really didn't know how to manage the heat back then. Liquid cooling was a thing that enthusiasts did, and then they eventually leaked and completely fried their motherboard. It wasn't like you could just go to Corsair's website and get an AIO and okay, everything's cool.
Cooler Master had an AIO that I think this thing was frequently paired with, but the component quality was not impressive. And I saw the results of this attempt at cooling all over the bottom of the case. I should note that many of the components that we're discussing here today were found outside at a junkyard, and so it's actually quite amazing that any of it functioned. But let's talk about one of those junkyard pieces, and that is the motherboard. Now, I went with Asus's classic A8N SLI Deluxe, an nForce 4 SLI based socket 939 board. So obviously we have two 16x PCIe slots. On this board, when in SLI mode, those actually operate at 8x apiece. Asus did release a later board, I think the A8N32 SLI, that could run both in 16. Not that it really matters. It's not like we're going to be saturating the 8x PCIe on this build. So who cares? But, some pretty nice features, pretty beefy looking VRM for the time. We've got 4 SATA 2 connectors coming off that nForce 4 chipset. We've got an additional 4 vanilla SATA 1 connectors off a SIL 3114 chip that's on the board as well. We've got dual gigabit Ethernet, dual FireWire, 8-channel audio, some pretty impressive sounding features.
This is like the classic nForce 4 motherboard.
Yeah.
And it's a good one because this era was when enthusiast hardware started to exist. So there was the DFI LAN party board, which nowadays looks tame because it doesn't have RGB everywhere, but it had fluorescent yellow PCIe slots and stuff.
Yeah.
And that was obviously an option, but it was good to have this Asus quality board that came out that wasn't as flashy, but did everything you needed it to do. And then SLI was, I guess, a rehashed but new kind of thing at that time, because AGP never supported any sort of dual GPU support. So that was kind of this cool feature that got everybody's attention, and I don't recommend using it. But
well, on this board especially is particularly odd. And so unlike all the other nForce 4 SLI boards that were reviewed around this time this came out in 2005, in order to run it in a stable SLI configuration, you have to attach this additional Molex. There's a Molex connector they put smack dab in the middle of the board, ruining all hopes of effective cable management. I don't know what you're supposed to do. They put a Molex right in the middle, and you're supposed to, connect that in order to get the thing to be stable in SLI mode. None of the other nForce 4 SLI boards have it. This one does, and if you don't plug it in, it has like a flashing red light to tell you that you've forgotten to do it. And also, interesting note at this time, you don't switch between SLI and non-SLI mode in the BIOS. You actually have this hardware card, an actual it's like, I don't know exactly what it does.
You might think it's like an M.2 now.
Yeah,
but it's not.
Kids, this is not an M.2 card. Well, it's in more of like a SODIMM sort of form factor, but this card has two edges. If you insert it one way, then you're set up for single PCIe graphics. If you insert it the other way, then you've configured the board for SLI. And you gotta make sure you get that in the right way. This board earned accolades because it was like the only one at its time that actually used a real like metal connector to hold in that card. The others used plastic ones that they said would probably not survive ever trying to change your setting. So that's kind of awkward if you're used to, modern SLI. This is quite different. And you might note the active cooling on that single chip nForce 4 solution. That is quite necessary. nForce 4 requires active cooling. Pretty much all of NVIDIA's chipsets required decent cooling. They tended to, especially with the sort of issues NVIDIA was having with packaging at the time, they tend to go wrong if they get too hot. And first you'll notice that your Ethernet stops working, or some less important features of the board will suddenly stop functioning, and the whole thing stops posting altogether. That usually means that your chipset fan has died and you've now toasted your chipset. So not many of these things survive. This is actually one of two 8-in SLI boards that I have. The one that I'm using now, the one that I found outside, actually was in better condition than the other one that I have. That was, from a build that wasn't recovered from the dump. But this one, for whatever reason, the capacitors on are totally fine. It's in frightfully good condition. The one that's actually in the machine. So, and it was totally stable. I updated the BIOS and it booted right up, and I went right to a 2.8 gigahertz overclock, no problems. I didn't ever think I'd be talking about the stability of an NVIDIA nForce product on this podcast / video show, but I was delighted by how stable this board was. I didn't get a single blue screen or lock in any of my benchmarking with overclocking and doing some crazy stuff toward the end that we'll talk about.
It's that dump luck you have.
I know. I got the best dump luck ever.
Yeah. We should note that we're talking about January 06, and pretty soon after that they released Socket AM2, but it wasn't really faster, at least initially. Just generally, whenever new memory comes out, it has pretty bad latency, specs. So it didn't really matter that this is just DDR1.
Yeah,
it was pretty mature and pretty fast.
People were pretty disappointed actually with AM2 at launch because it didn't really offer huge performance benefits over the outgoing Socket 939 with DDR1.
The graphics card.
The graphics card. So, Alan, allow me to introduce you to the Rodney Dangerfield of graphics cards. This is the graphics card that gets no respect.
Oh, really?
And yeah. So, in January of 2006, right, ATI releases the X1900 series of graphics cards. And at the time of release, these are the fastest single GPU solutions in games. The fastest consumer GPUs individually that you can buy. They feature 3 times the number of shader units over the outgoing X1800 series, which already was no slouch. And so this thing is basically the king of DirectX 9 video cards. And in games of the day, in pretty much all, Windows 9X through, early XP games, this thing is an absolute monster. And it also makes some monstrous sounds. If you thought the GeForce FX Dustbuster was bad, man, this thing is this thing is as dustbuster as dustbuster, at least when you turn the machine on. After that, it quiets the fans while it slowly overheats, but it's quite a monster. The reason why I called it Rodney Dangerfield of cards is that a few months later, well, not a few months, but in November of 2006, NVIDIA comes out with the GeForce GTX 8800 with the G80 GPU, its unified shader architecture, its enormous memory bandwidth, it being the largest die for any consumer product at that point, and it completely blows away everything else. Because the GeForce the GeForce 8800 GTX is faster than two X1950s in Crossfire. So
yeah, and it's the Tesla cores, right? So it's full of hype.
Yeah, it's hyped up. Elon's behind it. No, Elon was not behind the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 8800.
Before that was really a thing.
Yeah.
So in this process, this GPU also has a lady on it. So
yes, it does.
We have no question why you picked it.
So you've just seen this lady in action as part of our intro sequence. But in case you didn't know, that's Ruby. That is ATI's mascot at this point. And I think that as far as cringy GPU mascots go, I think Ruby is the best. She's an interesting, powerful heroine in the various Rhino FX demos that were put together for ATI products at this time, which you've just seen some clips from in the beginning of the show. I'm a Ruby fan. I'll take Ruby over Dawn and Nalu any day. The rival GPU mascot ladies. But yeah, this was an impressive piece of kit in January 2006. They'll be completely forgotten with the release of NVIDIA's products that blow it out of the way performance-wise. But yeah, at the time, this was amazing. And but I picked up mine brand new just a few years back for $20. So I didn't sell all of them.
Yeah.
But
do we want to talk about the alternate choice? Because I think my brother's concern was that it wasn't hot enough just having one GPU in the system, and
right.
And he does, again, on these lonely nights he gets cold and
right.
cries a little bit, so he wanted more warmth. Yes.
So I want to see, just in case we weren't able to get enough heat out of a single GPU, why not use this motherboard the way it was intended, the way it was meant to be played, with an SLI NVIDIA solution. So I also pulled out of storage two 7900 GT CO editions from EVGA and put them into SLI and did another full round of benchmarks and heat testing with them. We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about the relative performance of that, because I think Alan and I, we're kind of down on SLI. When we were messaging before this video, we both sort of had the opinion that SLI is great in some hand-selected benchmarks, but if you're looking broadly at the gaming experience that you get, it's a little finicky.
I'm okay with SLI with Voodoo 2.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's the thing. With 3DFX's SLI, it was completely transparent. There was no... Right. You're never oh, this doesn't work because I'm in SLI mode, so I'm getting huge frame tear, stutter, whatever, sort of problems that you see with...
And SLI would unlock 1024 by 768.
Yeah, it would also unlock higher resolutions on the Voodoo cards. Yeah, I mean, SLI Voodoo was amazing because it just worked. Your performance was just suddenly twice as good. And it scaled beautifully, and there were no real issues. They did a marvelous job with the engineering there. I don't know if we can say the same of NVIDIA's effort. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I think we still have one more piece of kit to talk about. So, of course, as we always say here, sound is 50% of the experience, which is why I took something else from the dump to provide additional audio.
From your cache of OEM parts?
From my drawer of OEM parts, from the top shelf of OEM junk that I have, I found... an OEM Alienware Creative X-Fi board in PCI that is very odd, and unlike any other X5 board, it's got another chip on the back that I'm not exactly sure what it does. Maybe it's a FireWire controller or something. I was confused by what it was when I saw it. That's why I picked it up, because I was intrigued. I later found out that Phil did a whole video about it. And thankfully, Phil was able to figure out where to find the drivers, because, of course, being an OEM creative product, you can't just install the normal drivers. No, you have to find the special drivers. So I was able, thanks to Phil's Computer Lab, shout out, to get the correct drivers for this. But, you know, it's a great EAX card, wonderful for Windows XP.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have no idea what this card is, but given that you've already thrown the whole Windows 9X part of the channel out of the window, you know...
You can play a lot of... So this build is still great for playing most Windows 9X games, not the early stuff, not like it needs DirectX 2, but, you know, the later titles, ones that continue to receive patches and things, will play great on this XP machine. I did go with XP for this build. It's the appropriate period correct OS for this. And also the XP product key was written on the side of the case that I found at the dump. And so it was very convenient. Yes. So, shall we talk about the benchmarks?
The benchmarks?
Well, first let's talk about the important part. How warm did it get? How much did it warm my heart? My cold, steely heart. Well,
first, what is ambient over there in your tropical
in my tropical location? So I was testing with a very pleasant 75 degree Fahrenheit ambient temperature, and during testing the CPU exhaust temperatures, I didn't measure. I wasn't looking at the die temperature, because obviously I'm not going to put my foot on the die while I'm playing. I was more interested in sort of what the breeze would be like coming off of it for my feet and lower extremities, and so we're getting mid-90s out of the back of this big Arctic tower cooler, which wasn't too crazy. I think that this big tower cooler I got was built for high-spec AM4 processors, and it can take quite a bit of heat. A pleasant surprise was the heat coming out of the blower on the X1900XT, which reached, while playing Crysis, well into the 150s. I saw it as high as 157. That's the air temperature coming out of the back of the GPU in Crysis. So that was quite toasty. Very pleasant.
Wow. Thank you, Crysis.
Yes. So Crysis plus the X1900XT is the cure for frostbite. If you need to defrost anything, you want to defrost a turkey or something, for your holiday meal, just X1900XT. That's the solution. I imagine the XTX will be even better. The 1950 XTX probably even better than that. But yeah, wow. So now we're not as concerned with these actual performance figures. Apple right now is chasing performance per watt. We're more concerned with watts per performance in order to keep us warm this winter. But we should, have some concern for the actual performance of this build. So starting with 3D Mark 03, we saw a very respectable score of 14,449 with the FX-60 X1900XT pairing on this SLI nForce 4 board with 2 gigs of DDR memory. And pretty much all the benchmarks, you were seeing 100 to 200 FPS, even the really demanding ones like the Proxicon demo and things like that. So really quite impressive performance. Now 3D Mark 03 is a slightly older benchmark than the vintage of the card, but it was still relevant. Future Mark sort of went a different direction with 3D Mark 06, where they started lumping in the CPU scores and things. So
right, but for this is like the ultimate DirectX 9 machine,
right?
Then 3D Mark 03 probably is the most appropriate at measuring that.
Yes, in terms of what sort of DirectX 9 gaming performance you can get, basic classic DirectX performance you're going to get, fixed pipeline for the most part, but it's pretty solid. So looking at actual games and not just these performance benchmarks. So as you might expect, 2004's Far Cry was an excellent experience on the X1900XT in this build. I was playing at 1280 by 1024 on very high settings with no AA, and I was seeing an average frame rate in the starting area of about 107. Minimum FPS was a comfy 58 frames per second, and maximum frame rate was up there at 197. And so, not unlike the 3D Mark demos, we're getting really between like 100 and 200 frames per second performance. Yeah. So, Far
Cry is not a problem at all.
Far Cry is a dawdle for this setup, but if you are looking to play Far Cry in a way which is really quite pleasant, I would definitely recommend this build. Good luck finding the FX-60, but it worked well. Because we like to ape Phil's Computer Lab in Fear, using the built-in performance test on the maximum preset, we were able to see at 86 frames per second average, minimums 40 FPS, and max of 209. So again, Fear plays wonderfully on this machine. I tried out Elder Scrolls Oblivion and didn't realize that I hadn't turned off the VSync. So we stayed at the 60 FPS pretty consistently, except when we were in a space with a lot of NPCs where things suddenly dipped into 35 for no reason, really.
It's unavoidable.
Given who wrote the game, I expect, most of the time you're going to have excellent performance, and then sometimes you're going to have Oblivion, Elder Scrolls performance. But, I was playing at 1280 by 1024, again, with ultra settings in this case, and most of the time we're right up against the 60 frame per second cap. So the question remains, will it run Crysis?
Oh, I thought you were going to say Cyberpunk.
Oh, will it run Cyberpunk? Oh, shoot, I forgot to try that. No, I'm sure somebody else is already on their YouTube channel trying to see how well it runs Cyberpunk 2077. I'm going to go for probably not on that, but will it run Crysis? Yes.
Yeah.
And also no. So
Crysis came out in 2007.
Crysis came out in 2007 and barely ran.
It didn't work then.
Yeah. Crysis was, released in 2007, focusing on NVIDIA's new high-end cards and Intel's Core 2 Duo chips. A generation beyond what we're playing with here. But can we still hang with those in 2007 on this rig? Well, doing the Island demo, on the medium preset, we did see about a 40, frame per second average. But the thing about the medium preset for Crysis is that it doesn't really look much like Crysis. Using the medium preset disables your motion blur, it disables depth of field effects. So it's not really a very Crysis experience. You really want to play Crysis on high or very high. And when we did that, basically the frame rate got cut in half. We saw, around 20 frames per second average, but with a lot of dips lower due to, poor I/O performance, the motion blur shader just beating the crap out of the card. Can you run Crysis? Yes. Should you run Crysis? Probably not.
It's kind of more of a GeForce 8800, 9800 kind of thing.
But even on those, it's not going to be that great.
I just wonder, is the CPU good enough, or is the GPU, like if you upgrade the GPU, do you think you could pull it out?
That's what I was wondering as well. So I didn't have an 8800 GTX, but I had a 9800 GTX, which is G92 based. Basically, it's a warmed over version of the original. It's a die shrunk version of it with some slightly higher memory clocks. But it actually physically didn't fit into the case. This case is a Raidmax Sagitta, a donk era / disco era, I think like 2003 gamer LAN party case. With like a side vent fan and a big window, and it has some nice toolless features. It has like toolless drive bays for the hard drives and for the optical drives, and so the there's a little, lever arm that sticks off the side of the 3.5-inch drive bay area.
Yeah, I was going to say just Dremel off the 3.5.
I basically would have to Dremel off the 3.5-inch drive bay area in order to actually be able to slot in the 9800 GTX. It's just too big. And what I probably should have done is built this out on a test bench, but I wanted to throw it in the case that I found the motherboard in because it seemed period correct. And I love all the flashing, horrible blue. This was like the era when blue LEDs were, a thing. Now that blue LEDs are possible, everything has to have a blue LED. So lots of blue LEDs. So we'll have to answer that question some other time. But I was able to answer the question of, does having SLI 7900 GTs with a mild overclock give you a performance benefit or a toasty socks benefit over ATI's X1900XT?
Either one I think we would take.
Either would be great.
Yeah.
In terms of heat output, actually real disappointment. Didn't really get much more than what the CPU was putting out of these GPUs. A little bit over 100, but they're not a blower design, so mostly it's just getting kind of circulated in the case and then sent out the back with the rest of the CPU exhaust. So it wasn't really pulling much weight in terms of heat. Now, on the performance side, initially things looked really good. I was testing with the 93.71 ForceWare drivers released, I believe in October of 2006. These are WHQL drivers from, roughly in the period. And in 3D Mark 03, we saw even better performance than with the X1900XT. A score of 18,259. So well ahead of the single X1900XT. Now, NVIDIA cards are known for putting up some pretty impressive 3D Mark numbers and then completely falling on their face when it comes to actual gaming. NVIDIA cards are also known for doing things like replacing the shader program used in 3D Mark with ones that are more convenient for it. And so we'll take that big number in 3D Mark go through with a grain of salt. I will say that we did see, similar to the X1900 XT, huge frame rates in all of the benchmarks, but let's not read too far into it. So looking at actual games, Far Cry ran admirably on the 7900 GT SLI setup, but not without issues. So the average frame rate was 98 FPS, minimums at 64, and highs at 153. So highs were a little bit lower, but average and minimum frame were a small improvement over what we saw in the X1900XT. So faster, but the water textures were glitched, which is something that I'd not heard of happening with period drivers on XP. That's something that people complain about with later drivers and on later versions of Windows, but I think this is probably an SLI specific problem. I didn't have enough time to test with other versions of ForceWare or with the later GeForce drivers, but that obviously is sort of made the experience less pleasant because we weren't really getting correct rendering.
And there's a lot of going through water in Far Cry.
Far Cry, I mean, water is like 90% of what you see, apart from trees, ferns and things. So, that was sort of a disappointment. So going back to Fear on maximum settings, 1280 by 1024, saw an average of 97 frames per second, 50 FPS minimum, 205 FPS max. There may be a handful of little stutters that I detected in the built-in performance test, which might have been SLI acting up again. But, it's still an extra 10 FPS to minimums, an extra 13 to average. So an improvement, arguably, in Fear. And I went and I tested Oblivion again, this time actually remembering to turn off VSync. And we saw basically a smooth 86 frames per second in the caves leading from the prison while knocking around the goblins in there. And then the same sort of unexpected drops into the mid-30s whenever there were a lot of NPCs on screen for reasons that are probably more related to the programming of the game. But didn't really see any rendering issues or anything like that when playing in Oblivion. So that was a pretty good experience there. So then I went and retested Crysis, because when you start Crysis, it shows you the way it was meant to be played, NVIDIA logo and all that. I figure, hey, maybe I'll get a little something out of these 7900 GTs. Actually, the Crysis Island benchmark was noticeably worse with the 7900 GTs and SLI. It reported an average frame rate of 16.24 at the high preset, but if you looked, like almost all the time, it was down below 10. Most of the time, it was at 9 and stuttery and awful. But then somehow, at some moments, it got some sort of erroneously high FPS that must have pulled it up, but it was noticeably less smooth than on the X1900XT. And interestingly, moving it to the medium preset, the average reported frame rate went from 16.24 all the way up to 17.1. With it being noticeably less stuttery and awful, but I think something's going on with SLI in that benchmark. But we definitely didn't see the twofold increase in frame rates moving from high back down to medium that we did with the X1900XT. So, definitely don't play Crysis on 7900 GTs and SLI. That's going to be awful. So
that's a bombshell there. Nobody could have predicted it.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to test Mirror's Edge. Now, this is another sort of slightly newer game. And I played it a little bit just for fun on the X1900XT, didn't benchmark it. Performance wasn't fantastic in any way. It's another sort of later game like Crysis. It's not really designed.
I'm guessing you never made any of the jumps. That's why you don't want. Okay, what did you get?
Okay, well, the footage would have looked bad. No, I made it through the tutorial. Thank you very much. But when I launched Mirror's Edge on the SLI setup, it just crashed outright. So we wouldn't be able to do much of a comparison there anyway. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. So I'm sticking to my conclusion about SLI that it's for you as an individual to be able to proclaim superiority and some carefully selected benchmarks. But as an actual enthusiast trying to revisit the games of this era, you are much better off with a single X1900XT and drivers that actually work and render things properly and generally provide a great experience than ones where it's hit or miss. You either get 10 extra frames or you get a crash or a rendering error. So I would stick with X1900. As I said, the Rodney Dangerfield of graphics cards for this era. But everyone forgot all about it as soon as NVIDIA's unified shader architecture was out. Then nobody ever looked back to these old cards. But they are fun to play around with. So that was my build. The funny thing is, all these games that I tested, I don't really enjoy playing most of them. What will I actually end up playing on this rig? Command & Conquer 3. Do you need any of this for Command & Conquer 3? Probably not, but...
and Red Alert 3.
There you go.
So you can have some oh my in your life.
Yeah. Alan,
George Decay.
Oh my. Do you have any reflections on this era? I missed most of 2006 gaming because I was starting my career at Apple and not buying up a whole bunch of high-end PC parts. Do you have any fond recollections?
I played a lot of Far Cry, and I thought it was pretty cool. I don't know about the rest of the games you mentioned. I think by Crysis I as well was kind of gone and didn't really miss it. Mostly, I don't know. Could you even play Crysis? I thought I had DRM issue.
So for a long time, I believe, so I believe Crysis used some sort of de novo or other DRM. And it wasn't until recently when they released Crysis DRM free on GOG that it really became accessible again. I used the GOG versions of all of these games for my testing. So I didn't have to worry about any of that DRM stuff because I'm not plugging in the Ethernet cable into the back of a Windows XP machine. It just doesn't seem like the brightest thing to do.
No, don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
this,
but
this thing was
I'm
air
excited.
gapped.
I'm excited to see how warm we can get. You know, I feel like there's more territory we can cover in terms of heat
Yes.
from this era.
Yes.
Well, we don't have like a Threadripper, but you know,
no, but
we've got some Intel competitors as well that I think could provide you that warmth that you need, Aus. But we should be back with some more 2006 hot processors.
some more hashtag hot procs. I guess proc
Yeah.
hot. Proc hot is the
Just
interrupt.
smear some liquid metal on there, and
That's
everything
right.
will be fine. Sure.
Yeah. I got to steal that Pro Media cooling unit from Victor Bart and try to hit some new highs on this thing. You know, I think that FX-60's got a little bit more to give. I don't know how much more, but given the ease with which I hit 2.8, I think I could try for 3. I'd like to see 3 on it. So we should say a big thank you to our audience for bearing with us in 2020 and spending some time playing through old PC games and talking about old hardware. We had fun. We grew our membership a lot this year, not anywhere near what we would need to actually monetize or anything like that, but it's fun to have more people enjoying the show and playing along with us. So thank you if you subscribe to the channel this year. We hope to see you again next year in 2021. Hopefully there won't be another global pandemic. And not that we're going to be done with this one until like probably late 2021 anyway, but do you have any 2020 closing thoughts for our audience?
Keep calm and carry on.
Keep calm.